Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back, brothers and sisters, to a new video of this series. In this series, we look at the claims made by J. Smith and his disciples about the Holy Quran, and we refute them. Today, we have another interesting claim from J. Smith, which we will look at.
In 652, Uthman now is caliph. Abu Bakr and Umar have both died. Uthman has another crisis on his hand. And he calls Zayd ibn Thabit, the secretary of Muhammad, once again, a second time, to rewrite the Quran, which was given to Hafsa, to take Hafsa's Quran, that original one, and to rewrite it. And if he was given 3 men to help him out, Alas, Zubair, and Hisham. The 4 of them were then to rewrite it again. And if they had any disagreement, they were to write it in the Qurayshi dialect. Now, does anybody here speak Arabic or read or write Arabic? Okay, what's wrong with that right there? What is wrong? How do you write it in a Qurayshi dialect? What's a dialect? How do you find dialectical differences in an Arabic text? Okay, but how do you write it down differently? You need the Dhamma, the Kasra, and the Fatha. Am I correct? The vowels. Because these are all vowels difference. And you also need diacritical marks, the dottings. Am I correct? Were there any dots, for those of you who speak Arabic, were there any dots in the 7th century? No. Dots were not invented till the 8th century. We're going to see that a little later. Were there any vowels in the 7th century? So how in the world does this make any sense to you? Why has no one noticed this before? We've noticed it. Al-Fadi, who I work with from Saudi Arabia, who's doing his doctorate in this area, has noticed it because he speaks fluent Arabic and he understands exactly the problem with this. He says you cannot have dialectical differences in a written text in the 7th century.
Hold on a minute. Do any of you see what I see? Have you any of you picked this up? Obviously, Shabir Ali didn't see, or if he did, he didn't say it, because this is a real glaring problem, and nobody seems to understand this. How can you write something down, written down, in a dialectical text unless you have vowels? Because dialects, by definition in Arabic, require vowels and require dots.
Well, let me ask you this, David. How do you write a dialectical form? How do you write a dialect in a consonantal text? Because remember, the Arabic is only consonantal. It doesn't have any vowels. Those were added much, much later. The Dhamma, the Kasra, the Fatha. How do you write a consonantal text in a dialectical form if there's no dots? There were no dots in the 7th century. So what does this mean? Does this make any sense to you?
No, never has. And
Well, I think the claim is very clear, isn't it? Uthman said to Zayd ibn Thabit and the other 3 who were with him to write the Quran in the Qurayshi dialect. According to Jay, it was impossible to write it in a Qurayshi dialect or in any other dialect for that matter, because there were no vowels and dots, and because there were no vowels and dots, it is impossible to write it in any dialect. And this doesn't make sense to Jay. It doesn't even make sense to the crossdresser.
So what does this mean? Does this make any sense to you?
no, never has.
And how did Jay find out about this big hole in the Islamic narrative? A man called Al-Fadi told him this. He's preparing his PhD in the Sana manuscript, and he's an Arab. And he told Jay that it was impossible to write it in any dialect unless you have the vowels and the dots, which were introduced, according to Jay, in the 8th century. Makes sense, doesn't it? Well, let's see. So let's start with understanding what the word dialect means. Let's go to the Cambridge Dictionary. According to Cambridge Dictionary, dialect is a form of a language that people speak in a particular part of a country, containing some different words and grammar. I repeat again, containing some different words and grammar. If a dialect contains different words, then we can write a dialect without the need for vowels and dots. I think that's more than enough to refute Jay's claim, right? But I don't think it would be fun if we just stopped at that. And also, there can be some sort of stupid comeback. He might say, well, I'm talking about the Arabic language, and the Cambridge Dictionary is not talking specifically about the Arabic language. In the Arabic language, you could not have different words. And if you think Jay will never say that, then you're wrong. Actually, he did say that.
Comeback from many of you. And there is one comeback that seems to be coming up over and over again. That concerns my statement that I made there about the dialects, the dialectical differences in the 7th century. And one particularly I want to use as a standard, and this is the one that by Richard O'Keefe. Let me just read what Richard, if you're listening, Richard, you know where I'm going with this. He says, before you make another video on this subject, consult an expert in the historic Semitic linguistics. Start by reading his 2012 paper, and he goes and gives me where it is, about automatically detecting modern dialects in written Arabic. And Richard, I went and I looked at it, and the problem with that is he's talking about modern Arab dialects. Do you see the difficulty? Modern Arab dialects, yes, do follow these Razm and also dialectic rules, but that's modern. We're not talking about modern. Remember, I'm always telling people, get back to the very beginning. We need to talk about the 7th century. I'm not interested in the 20th century. I'm not interested in the 21st century. I'm not even interested in the 9th and 10th century Arabic. I'm interested in 7th century. So that didn't help. And he goes on and says, among today's dialects, again, today, there are differences in morphology, vocabulary, and sentence structure that would have shown up in the early writing system. You certainly don't need the short vowels to discriminate dialects today. Whether long vowels are necessary is not discussed in that paper.
Oh dear, this is hilarious. But I like this guy though, because he makes my job easier. The interesting thing about Jay Smith is that when he's refuted on his stupid claim, he responds by making a more stupid claim, and without providing any piece of evidence. I mean, what evidence did he provide for the claim that now we can write dialects without the need for vowels and dots, but in the 7th century that was not possible? What evidence did he provide? Nothing. Now we will begin with showing you several examples that will completely destroy this argument once and for all. Let's begin. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay, this is the first example. In the Quran, we have the name of Prophet Abraham mentioned. According to the reading of Hafs, we read the name as Ibrahim. Ibrahim. And according to other reading, for example, Ibn Amr reading, we read it as Ibrahim. Look at the text in Arabic. The one on top is Abraham, the one below is Ibrahim. Based on this first example, it is possible to write different dialects without the need for vowels and dots. Next, this is the name of one of the angels. His name is Mikael. As per the reading of Hafs, in a variant reading, it is read as Mikal. Mikal. You can clearly notice the difference between the two words. So based on this second example, it is possible to write different dialects without the need for vowels and dots. Next. Now this is the best one, because this is part of the story of how Uthman compiled the Quran. So this is very relevant to the topic we are discussing. You all remember the hadith which says that Uthman instructed Zayd and the other 3 Qurayshi men to write it in the Qurayshi dialect. If they ever disagree with Zayd, they should write it in the Qurayshi dialect. This is a case where they disagreed with Zayd. They disagreed with Zayd on the word At-Tabut. The 3 Qurayshi men said At-Tabut and Zayd said At-Tabuh. There is clearly a difference in how you write the 2 words. They disagreed. They went to Uthman and Uthman said, you write it in the Qurayshi dialect, At-Tabut. So this is an example from the same story. If only you read Islamic sources, you wouldn't have made that stupid mistake. Mate, read. All we are asking you to do is to read. Read Islamic sources. We don't ask you to read too much. Just read some Islamic sources. I am a layman and I could find this information. You claim to be an expert. Why can't you find them? Next. Here is another example. This is a hadith narrated by the famous companion Abu Huraira. This hadith contains the word knife, which means sakin in the language of Quraysh. After narrating the hadith, Abu Huraira said that it was the first time he has ever heard of the word sakin, because they call it in their language, which is the language of Daws, one of the Arabian tribes. They call it Madiyah. Madiyah and Sakina means the same thing, but they are both written differently. So again, it is possible to write different dialects in the 7th century without the need for vowels and dots. Now let's take these 6 examples of different dialects from the 7th century. The first one is called Ajaja. This is the language of a tribe called Qudaa. They replace the letter Ya with the letter Jim. Example, Kursi, which means chair. They pronounce it as Kursij with Jim, from Kursi to Kursij. Clearly you can see that the last letter in both words are different, which means it was possible to write dialects without the need of vowels and dots. The second example is called Qamtamaniya. This is the language of Himyar. They replace the article al with am. And for this one we have a prophetic hadith from Musnad Ahmad. The hadith says, Laysa minam birri am siyamu fi am safar. You see the first 2 letters in red. This is am. This is the language of Himyar. But in the Qurayshi language it is al. You can see the difference here. Al-bir versus am-bir. As-siyam versus am-siyam. As-safar versus am-safar. So they are written differently, which means you can write different dialects in 7th century without the need for vowels and dots. The next example is called Anana. This is the language of a tribe called Tamim. They replace the letter Alif with the letter Ain. When the letter Alif comes in the beginning of the word, for example, Innaka, they pronounce it as Annaka. Al-Farra narrated that some people of the tribe of Tamim would say to Prophet Muhammad, Ashhadu annaka Rasulullah, as opposed to Ashhadu annaka Rasulullah. Innaka and annaka are clearly written differently, which means again it is possible to write different dialects without the need for vowels and dots. Next example is called Fahfaha. This is the language of Hadil, and this one is very interesting because Hadil is the tribe of the famous companion Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and you know Abdullah ibn Mas'ud has his own shadh, non-standard reading. Hadil replaces the letter Ha with the letter Ain when the letter Ha comes at the beginning of the word. The example of this dialect is going to be from the Holy Quran. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud's reading of Surah Al-Mu'minun verse 54 is Atta Ain. According to the Qurayshi dialect, it is Hatta Hin. When Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second caliph, was told about this, he said to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, teach people to recite the Quran in the language of Quraysh. The Quran was not revealed in the language of Hadil. You can see there is a huge difference in writing in both texts, Hatta Hin versus Atta Ain, which means you can write a dialect in the 7th century without the need of vowels and dots. Next is called Istinta. This is also the language of Hadil. They replace the letter Ain with the letter Nun. And it has been narrated that there is a shadh, non-standard reading of Surat Al-Kawthar as Inna Antaynaka Al-Kawthar rather than Inna A'taynaka Al-Kawthar. Antaynaka is different from A'taynaka. Both are written in different ways, which means you can write different dialects in 7th century without the need of vowels and dots. And there are several hadith of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ where he used this istinta dialect. It's been narrated that he said to a man, Antihi kada wa kada. Antihi, which means give. In the language of Tamim, it's Antihi. In the language of Quraysh, it is A'tihi. Antihi and A'tihi both are different. He also, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, said, Malullahi mas'ulun wa munta, which means Malullahi mas'ulun wa mu'ta. Munta and mu'ta are written differently, which means you can write different dialects in 7th century without the need of vowels and dots. The last one is called kashkasha, which means replacing the letter kaf with the letter sheen when the letter kaf comes at the end of the word, as in alayk and alayk versus alaysh. Alayk and alaysh are written in different ways, which means it is possible to write different dialects without the need for vowels and dots. And you know what? I can show you hundreds, not hundreds, actually thousands of examples refuting J. Smith, but it's pointless. I think the examples we have seen so far is enough to show that J. Smith is completely ignorant on the Islamic sources. Believe me, I didn't spend weeks to find this information. I didn't spend days to find them. I didn't even spend hours. It took me few minutes, even seconds, to find them. So I'm very sorry for the followers of J. Smith. I say this maybe in each video I make, but I truly mean it. I feel sorry for them. Seriously, you guys are wasting your time.
مثل الذين حملوا التوراة ثم لم يحملوها كمثل الحمار يحمل أسفارا بئس مثل القوم الذين كذبوا بآيات الله والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين.